My name is Yevana Knežević, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Russian and East European and Eurasian Studies here at Stanford. And we are absolutely delighted today to be joined by Professor Dominique Kirchner-Reill. It is my great pleasure to introduce her. I and my students have been reading her for years with great pleasure. And so we are really, really happy that she is with us today to share her new book, which I have here with me.
You have it.
I do have it, but it looks like I need, here we go. It's like coming in and out, the Fiume crisis.
Forever for me to get it. I think Brexit didn't help.
Yeah, life in the wake of the Habsburg Empire. Professor Reill is Associate Professor of History at the University of Miami, and her scholarship specializes in modern European history with a particular emphasis on the 19th century, post-World War I Europe, post-World War II Europe, and I think she's really one of the leading scholars of imperial and post-imperial Western Balkans working today and doing really exciting scholarship from writing history from below. And we'll see that today. Her first monograph was titled Nationalists Who Feared the Nation, Adriatic Multinationalism in Habsburg, Dalmatia, Trieste, and Venice. And that was published by Stanford University Press in 2012 and was highly praised and received the 2014 Book Prize from the Center of Austrian Studies, as well as an honorable mention from the Southern Historical Association's 2012 Smith Book Award for European History. Professor Reill is very active in the field, serving on the boards of a number of journals, most recently Contemporary European History, as well as on European history series presses. And today she is presenting to us her second book, as I said, called The Fiume Crisis, Life in the Wake of the Habsburg Empire, that came out with Belknap Press, Harvard University Press, just this past December. And this book recasts what we know about the birth of fascism, the rise of nationalism, and the fall of empire after World War I. And it tells the story of a 3-year period when the Adriatic city of Fiume, today known as Rijeka, in Croatia, generated an international crisis with the occupation of Gabriele De Nunzio, as with poet soldier. And so without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Professor Reill to tell us about her book. And you will have the opportunity both during the presentation and afterwards to enter any questions that you have in the Q&A. And following the presentation, I'll come back and help Professor Reill moderate the Q&A and respond to your questions. So once again, welcome. We're so pleased to have you here. We wish you could be here, but we're happy to have you here with us virtually. We very much look forward to your talk.
Oh, well, I mean, I gush at this whole thing. And the minute that Yevana invited me, my answer, I think, was 20 seconds after, which should be strange because I got my BA at Berkeley and I should be like hard to get. But I'm not, and part of that is not just because Stanford's a fancy place, it's because of Norman Naimark, and Stanford University Press, who helped my career with a completely unknown person, really wonderfully. I mean, my love for being here today on this Zoom thing at 9 o'clock at night in Italy alone, trying to understand who's even on this call. I have no idea who's in the audience. It's very weird to do this is I just need, if Norman Naimark is out there, just know thank you for saying yes to my first book and being so supportive. Thank you, Stanford. But this is not a Stanford book. This is a Harvard book. This is a book that was built out of anger. My first book was a book of revelation, of learning things I was trained never to find. This was a book about anger, of why was I trained not to see it. And it wasn't because of my teachers, it was because of this very public historiography. This was is a very different book. My first book was not a book from below, it was a book from above. It was about how nationalism was made from above. This book is a book from below. So I'll just start out with saying what this book is, how it started out, what the structure of the book is, and then I was given permission to go a couple minutes over and say, what does the book feel like? So please don't hate me that I go over 35, I might do 42. So I just, because I don't know who's here, who the hell knows where Fiume is? Also because on the map today, unless you're reading an Italian map, there is no Fiume on the map. It's probably not because of where the town is today. This is what Rijeka, the town today, it's the third largest city in Croatia. Actually, this thing here is the river. Fiume means river, Rijeka means river. This is not a big river. This is not the Danube. This is not the Mississippi. This is not some kind of world monumental thing that you would name a town after. This was the dividing line in medieval times or even pre-medieval times of bishoprics or dioceses or bureaucracies. This river is so insignificant that in every language, its name is Little River. But it's very significant in its bureaucratic meaning. Today, Rijeka includes both sides. And that's why I used the Italian word for the town instead of today's name, because before 1945, Fiume was just this side. I hope you can see the mouse. But today, Rijeka includes also that side, and also more parts over on the other side. Before 1918, this side of the river was part of Croatia, Slavonia. This was the semi-autonomous city-state of Fiume, and just a little bit over, parts that today are part of Rijeka were part of Istria that was part of Austria. So this little strange thing, this Corpus Separatum, which they used to call it, was the 9th largest port in continental Europe before World War I. And it was this, it was a hub controlled by Budapest. But this is not why anyone would know anything about it. Most people would know something about it because of this stuff, because of Margaret Millen's work, because of the Paris peace treaties. Fiume is the reason for the only walkout in 1919 from the Versailles Conference. And it was about Fiume, and it was about Italy and Wilson wanted this town of 50,000 people to be part of the forming what we would later call Yugoslavia. And Italy, which was one of the members of the Entente, one of the winners, felt like this was unfair and their populace demanded having it, and they didn't understand why they shouldn't get it. There were many demands not met in 1919 at the Paris Peace Treaty. This was a big event during the peace treaty, but we've forgotten many of those events. The reason why Fiume continues to be part of our historiography isn't just what happened during the peace treaty, it's what happened during and after the peace treaty. It's about this continuation story about nationalism outside the state. And it figures around this guy who's not my favorite human in the world, Gabriele De Nunzio, an amazing poet. I have nothing to say about his genius. He was a genius. He knew how to use a pen. He was already super famous before World War I. And then he became even more famous because the aesthete of the pre-war decided to become a soldier, one of the oldest officers in World War I. And he wasn't a fake soldier. He actually risked his life and all this stuff. And he became the face of a movement of why you were in the war was about nationality and about the state is about feeling. And Fiume for him after the war became the essence of what was wrong with what was going on in Paris. And he convinced and was convinced, he didn't create this out of nothing, but I'm trying to tell the story the way people know the story. This, by the way, if you're thinking this is De Nunzio, if you're thinking this convertible wasn't red, you're wrong. It was a red convertible. I mean, just imagine, it's like Miami. He comes with a red convertible to Fiume in September 1919 with 200, 300 veterans, decommissioned soldiers, current soldiers, who knows whoever's hanging around, and they literally enter Fiume without a single shot being fired. And they don't just enter the town, they kick out the inter-allied troops that are sitting in this town to keep it up for grabs for the peace treaty that's going on in Paris. So while Wilson and Clemenceau and Lloyd and everyone is arguing about how to organize the map and make it all make sense, what he literally did is, let's see what you got. And it's hard to like tell these stories separately, but he basically came in and the world left and let him take it. And this became an enormous story. And again, that's a great story, but the reason why, if you've ever heard about this Fiume story, it's actually not even because of this event, it's because of this. It's about this argument about proto-fascism. So it's not just an amazing thing happened. How could a poet take over a town? It's actually because there's some larger meaning about that poet taking over the town. And it's usually the March on Fiume is the precursor of the March on Rome. So when people try to explain how these are connected and how Fiume is proto-fascism, it starts with talking about De Nunzio, but it very quickly moves to the followers. It very quickly moves to the legionnaires, as they're called. And I mean, I really don't know who's in the audience, so forgive me if I'm simplifying, or forgive me if I'm not giving enough information, but these guys are coming from a motley world. They're coming from all sorts of different reasons why they're there. And yet, as you can see here, they're there for Fiume or death. They're all coming from Italy. There's also some internationalists that are coming from all sorts of other places because they love De Nunzio, but most of them are coming from Italy. And they think this means something. And they are taking the spirit of World War I. So if you're thinking about paramilitarism, or you're thinking about nationalism and the how there's a direct line between World War I and fascism, it's really hard to not look at these guys. Also because many of them then became fascists. The other reason why it's really hard to not think that this is a linear story is because of how it ends. It ends in a 4 or 5 day war. It's called the Christmas of Blood, the Bloody Christmas, at the end of 1920, in which the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes and the Kingdom of Italy finally made a peace treaty. I mean, far later than most of the countries after World War I, in which Fiume, no one could decide what to do with Fiume, so they decided to create a Danzig or Gdansk on the Adriatic, and so that no one would get it. They just couldn't suppress this hotspot. And De Nunzio basically decided no. And against the communal council, against many of his followers, he decided, let's bring it, let's have war. And he was pretty sure Italy wasn't going to attack. Italy did. And so we have a war against this nationalism outside the state, which I think for people who are studying fascism right now, and we're going to have a lot of conferences around 1922. I mean, we're just around the corner. I'm already part of planning all of them. is that what would have happened if the state had actually gone to war on Mussolini in 1922? Well, actually, the state did go to war against D'Annunzio in 1920. And so we have brothers fighting brothers. It's called the Christmas of Blood. Less than 50 people died. I mean, this is all D'Annunzio. But one way or the other, this all seems like a story that explains a lot. It explains how nationalism is no longer being determined by the state, determined by the capital, and you're having all of these agents outside who are using charisma to enliven and create politics in a world of an illiterate 19th century, trying to introduce democracy but control it, give no one suffrage. You know, the Mark Mazauer argument about what happens in the 30s is the failure of liberalism. Strangely enough, the people who also agree with this argument are ex-Yugoslav historians who see this story as just like, see, it's not just Mussolini. Italian racism and xenophobia against all of the Slavic speakers has always existed. Why is this story about Fiume about Italians? Over half of the population of this town did not consider itself mother tongue Italian. And if you consider the hinterland, what are you talking about? How is this all about Italy? And so for the historiography in the post-war especially is about how Italian nationalism has always been imperialist, and that D'Annunzio is just fascism, even though he was never a fascist. He never identified himself as a fascist. The fascists didn't think he was fascist, but the nationalism and the erasure did feel the same. This story is so embedded in the history of Italian fascism. I almost dare anyone to find me a history of fascism where D'Annunzio is not mentioned, or Fiume. It's always there. It is the prototype of the, some people would say, if you speak German, Führerprinzip. It is the idea of charismatic leadership. It is the guy on the balcony. It is the yeah, yeah, yeah. It is all the songs. It is the black things. It's the making people drink castor oil. All this stuff is going on. This is World War I stuff. This stuff was already going on. It's the traditions of World War I that are taken out of the war and made part of the civilian experience. It's also now been brought into other historiographies that have nothing to do with trying to explain Italy, but have a lot to do with trying to explain anger politics or populism. So Papa Gevat has an entire chapter on Fiume in which he shows how paramilitarism, how these legionnaires, how the followers are like the Freikorps, like all these other lost soldiers who are deeply disillusioned and basically screwed by their state. And they are active agents that are left alive. The war can't end with these people. And Pankaj Mishra as well, he starts off, the introduction of his book is D'Annunzio brainwashing a crowd of angry people and trying to explain why they're angry. So what's so weird about all these stories is this town that no one knows where it is and no one's ever heard of, and I swear it's really annoying to write a book about this, is that it does mean too much. This was a town of 50,000 people that's being used in global history. It's fascinating in which it means so much and yet we don't even know where it is. It's also really weird because it doesn't really fit into these categories it's been put into. It's got too many categories. It's overwritten, this story, because it lasted 15 months. D'Annunzio thought he would come up with the red Corvette, you know, whatever. It wasn't a Corvette, it was a Fiat, but it was, it had the red car in 1919. That's pretty cool. A lot of people went there for so many different reasons. Some of them were monarchists, some of them were syndicalists, some of them were bon vivants, some of them were what we would call today libertarians, some of them were just didn't want to leave the army, and this seemed like some way to still be there. so we have these stories, and this is very popular right now. I don't know if any of you have been following. I mean, this is the story now. It used to be about paramilitarism. Now it's about the alternative lifestyle. There's a lot of homosexuality going on in this town. There's all sorts of futurists and gay poets and crazy parties and all this stuff and nudism. And so 15 months of guys with nothing to do turns into a story of what do guys do in 15 months who have all this power and are bored. And it really revolves around this culture of being outside the world, making a utopia, but not really knowing what the utopia is. The most famous author here is Claudia Salaris. She's written this book called the Festa de la Rivoluzione, the party of the revolution, and it is the story of the party. But putting these all together, they fit really weird. I remember a friend of mine who's reading my introduction. She said, how does fascism fit with all the partying? You know, how does this all go together? It's a great question because there's very little violence here. And anytime you take violence out of fascism, that's really dangerous. And that's why I feel really weird with all these stories being put together. If you look at D'Annunzio and his legionnaires, in Fiume, it is not the same story as looking at the beginnings of fascism in 1919 and 1920 in Italy, or even in Trieste. So why is it so different? Even the war of the state of Italy against the town of Fiume has less than 50 deaths. Is that a war? Is that just a demonstration that went wrong? What's going on here? What are we telling? So my book has really been about why is there so little violence in this story that sounds like all of the check marks of a linear history of going from World War I, the absurdity of Wilson and nationalism and the Versailles treaties, paramilitarism, take over the state, interethnic communities. This should be a bloodland, to use someone's phrase, or a shattered empire, to use someone else's. The answer to why there hasn't been a lot of blood has been about charisma. It's been about this picture. There he is. That's D'Annunzio. By the way, this is not in Fiume. This is in Genova. Is about charisma. So until now, very, very smart historians who've worked very diligently have said none of this makes sense. And that's what's crazy about nationalism. But I think they've been assuming that this was all about the people that followed the town instead of the town. What if Fiume isn't the legionnaires? Over half of the town before 1918 did not identify as a mother tongue Italian speaker. And there is a lot of multilingualism there, and I'm not, I'm the first to say, what someone says is mother tongue, who knows how those censuses work, but more or less, this is a boom town of people coming from everywhere. In the 20 years before World War I, it expanded by 60%. The majority of the people who came were not from Italian-speaking lands. This was never part of Italy. Italian was lingua franca, no doubt, but the majority of people that are there are from all over. This is not a homogeneous place. Like all of what we call Habsburg Europe, like all of basically most of Europe. And so how do you have a nationalist poet with his legionnaires taking over, calling everything Italian, and there's so little violence? That has been my question. If everyone was a nationalist already, the charisma thing would make total sense. But what if we thought about Fiume and not the followers? So that was the basic idea of the book. If Fiume is so ethnically diverse, why didn't it turn into a bloodbath like all the other stories we know, like the Baltics, like the Freikorps, like Macedonia, like much of what would become Yugoslavia, Ukraine? Because these guys are not a peacekeeping force. These are D'Annunzio followers. So if you think it's because of them, there's not a lot of violence, that's just insane. These guys are bored people who want to be part of fun stories, most of whom are coming from World War I and violence. So it was a search for why wasn't there more death? Why isn't this a bloodline? And what I found, and basically the beginning of this, I didn't know what the answer was. I just thought, let's read people the town and not say this is Italianissima, the way De Nunzio has always said. And what I found was a state that was trying to make sure it didn't become a bloodland. So it's separated out into 5 chapters. This is how I think about books, and this is how Harvard thinks about books. I do have to admit that I think Harvard thinks about books better. Good job, Harvard. The first chapter is what I just, the introduction is what I just did. Then there's like all the different, long histories of what we know. And then 2, 3, 4, and 5 are what I love. This is like really trying to see on the ground why a diverse community is on board with Italian nationalism. Why isn't it painful? The second chapter is on money. So the Habsburg Empire, both the Austrian and the Hungarian side, it was the Austro-Hungarian kingdom, had the same currency. So we've always talked about what makes Austria-Hungary one state. There's the foreign, whatever, there's the finance office, there's the military. The other thing is currency. So since 1892, they all had the same currency. It was stamped in Vienna. It's called the crown, the Habsburg crown, or the Austro-Hungarian crown. On one side, it was in German with all the other languages underneath. On the other side, it was only in Hungarian. But it was the same money everywhere in Austria-Hungary. And when in late October, Austria-Hungary disappeared, it was still the same currency, even though the state disappeared. In around February, March 1919, what would become Czechoslovakia and what would become the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes started stamping the money in order to create an economic national place. And by summer 1919, every single territory of the ex-Habsburg Empire started stamping money. And what does stamping money mean? It means that if you took your dollar, and everyone in all the 50 states has the same dollar, and we all secede from each other, and California stamps, and New York stamps, and Florida stamps, and Indiana stamps, that at the moment of stamping, they all mean the same thing. Once they've been stamped, their value changes. The stamp is made by the state. The money is the same. Fiume is a successor state. I know it sounds absurd, it's 50,000 people, but they stamp too. And their money is worth less than some monies and worth more than others. They're worth a lot more than the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which is the entire territory surrounding them. And the reason why they do is because they are systematically devaluing their currency to make it match the lira, because they want, the government wants the currency to be as close to the lira as possible so that annexation is possible. So my chapter on this is, people in Fiume are told, if we annexed Italy, our money will be worth so much more. And if we don't annex Italy, it'll be worth so much less. And so it's about the lived experience of what does it mean when money is out of control, and this day-to-day anxiety with a government as well that actually can't secure anything. The second, chapter 3, is about law and what they do after the end of World War I is, instead of saying, well, the government wants to be, the official National Council wants to annex itself to Italy, but they don't know what to do. No one will let them annex themselves to Italy. Even Italy won't let them annex. In April 1919, the Kingdom of Italy tells them they're not allowed to decide who to annex themselves to. The Paris Peace Conference will decide where they stand. So what they do is they say on paper that they're part of Italy, but in their laws, what they do is they decide how much they want to become Italian and how not. They bricolage their law system. What that really means is they keep everything they like, get rid of everything they don't, and add some stuff that they like from the Italian legal code, and they call it Italian. And in chapter 4, which is on citizenship, what happens when a state disappears? Who's part of a state or not? It might sound like a nationalist question. It's not a nationalist question. It's about ration cards. It's about subsidies. It's about veterans payments. It's about who's fired and who's not. About who is dependent on the state is about who has rights in the state. Before 1914, you were either a Hungarian citizen or an Austrian citizen or Italian citizen or many other citizens. And then you would have this thing called Heimatrecht, which I'm not going to get into right now, but it was this other form of insurance policy of if you run into need, your local place will take care of you. And what happens in 1918 when the Habsburg Empire disappears is that Fiume decides, well, no one will let us be part of Italy. So we have two choices. Either we could call it Fiume's citizenship, but we don't want to be a state. So what we'll just do is use Habsburg Heimatrecht, pertinency, that's what they called it. So we'll just do pertinency and expand it. So what they do is they use a Habsburg imperial category, they expand it so that more people can be part of it. Only 30% of people living in Fiume had Heimatrecht in Fiume, even though they were legal residents there. And they just expand it to let more people in. They do use nationalist categories, but they're thinking about how to consolidate who we are. So it's actually, De Nunzio's followers are repeatedly denied Fiume pertinency, Fiume Heimatrecht, because they're not Fiume. So what's going on here is a story of nationalism, of wanting to annex sex to Italy and calling it nationalism, but at the same time, it's using imperial categories to keep a distance, a separation, a sense of, I can decide who's in and out. I don't care if you're Italian, that's great for you, but you're not Fiume. And the last chapter is about propaganda and education. So it's about language laws, flags. The state is trying to show legitimacy. It's trying to show the Fiume state in this time period that they are allowed to declare themselves part of Italy because they are a sovereign state. And if a sovereign state wants to do something with itself, no one can tell them they can't. So they're doing something very strange. They're saying to Wilson and the Paris Peace Conference, and they have delegates there, we are a state. The Habsburg Empire is gone. We were a semi-autonomous city-state. Now the empire is gone, so we're independent. With our independence, we want to annex to Italy. So they use the state to do this through language laws, through flags, through name changes, and through education. But once you look at what they're doing kind of the same thing as they're doing with law and citizenship. They're saying, we want to say it's Italian, but we're doing it on our own terms. They're not using any of the Italian laws on any of this. They're doing Fiume first in every one of these categories. So basically, the whole book together is a really on the tough view of what's going on here and why are people not killing each other. And it's because under political nationalism, there's this consolidation of what was already there that was always problematic. This was never, this is not Habsburg nostalgia. This is just that if you were from Fiume, what's going on in Fiume is just play along. If you can play along, your life won't change that much. And maybe we can get back to where we were before. If you don't play along, your life will change enormously. Playing along is calling for Italy. What they are saying explicitly and implicitly is Italy will be the new Habsburg Hungary. Fiume will have the same autonomy, and we can have the same prosperity as we had before. Fascinating story. Could be just a crazy story. I don't think it is, because a lot of the problems that Fiume is facing are the same problems all of these new successor states are facing. How do you make money matter with forgeries and all these stamps and all the networks across the borders, all the problems that Fiume is having doing this, all of these new successor states are having. All the little workarounds on the law, this is happening everywhere. In fact, it's even more complicated, and it's even more, let's just close our eyes and pretend this isn't different. This is different, even though it's not. Everywhere else, citizenship as well. Heimatrecht is, I've gone a little insane in my career now with Heimatrecht, but also with education and maps and flags. This question of how do you not make revolution, and of course you see this big thing here, the Soviet Union, we've got a revolution going on right there. We have what's going on in Hungary and also in Germany, but everywhere, revolution is brimming everywhere. And a lot of these new forming successor states are trying to figure out how to make a state out of this that can survive the trauma that they've been living. That's the book as a whole. I was told I was allowed to go a couple minutes over. Is that still true, Johanna?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I don't think that this is a pretty dorky book, if you hear it the way I just told it. I don't think that Belknap would have taken this book except for how it's written. So I'm just going to give you a little taste of how the book is a little different than just an argument. And I'm going to do chapter 3, a little section of chapter 3 from law. So remember, I said they are using law in a pretty sneaky way. They're saying, we're going to become Italian. They change everything to Italian. But things are pretty tough after World War I, and law really matters. Law keeps, it was already tough during the war. It's getting even tougher. And what's really tough is eating. What's really tough, especially in a hub city that is a semi-autonomous unit that is absolutely dependent on trade in order to feed its populace. And I know 50,000 people sounds like nothing. It is nothing. But in that region that has been booming precisely because it's a hub, having all the disruptions in communications and not knowing where the borders are and everything, it's a huge problem. Fiume is a hub. It's a hub in every single sense. It's right on the border between Habsburg, Austria and Habsburg, Hungary. It's a port city and it's a railway town. So food was never a problem. If anything, people ate better there than anywhere else. And this is precisely what Ivan Rosic counted on. Ivan Rosic was someone that I dare you to find him anywhere else than me. He was a 56-year-old innkeeper in a town 15 kilometers outside of Fiume who ran an inn and, knew his farmers, and he sold 3 wagons of cabbage, krauti, what would become sauerkraut, to Slavko Ivancic, I think his name is, yes, for 4,000 crowns. And it was on October 23rd. October 23rd is the day that the Hungarian troops were told to leave, that Fiume was never going to be part of Hungary. And all of a sudden, one day, the entire government disappeared. And so on the 24th, an agent who was representing Ivan Rosic came to Slavko Ivancic and said, here's your money. We're really sorry we can't give, because of all of the problems with the disaster of the chaos, there's no way to bring in the food here. And if Slavko Ivancic had bought 3 wagons of krauts for himself, that probably would be fine. But who eats 3 wagons of krauts? Of course, he bought this and he already sold it to other people. And so he's like, no, you can't do this to me. I've already sold all of this to other people. And it's not true you couldn't have brought it in. all the railways were open. Just because the Hungarians left does not mean that I couldn't get this. And so on November 1st, at the same time as the inter-allied troops are coming and Fiume is starting to become something in the news, Savko Ivančić goes to the Fiume courts and sues Ivan Rosic about not delivering the 3 cabbage wagons. And it keeps on going. This turns into a process until March 1920. So from November 1918 until March 1920, there is suits and countersuits between these two men about these 3 wagons of cabbage. And the argument of Ivan Rosic is force majeure. The state fell apart. There was no way I could bring you this. And the Fiume courts, at the same time as all this nationalism is going on, and then De Nunzio arrives, and all of the stuff about making new laws and sovereignty and all this stuff, they keep on following it up. They don't just say, okay, who's right and who's wrong. They send agents to all the towns in what is Croatia to interview them in Croatian. And what they finally find is that Ivan Rosic lied. He didn't get the right licenses to bring the cabbage in the first place. He tried to save money. That's why the cabbage was blocked. The point of this whole story is that the Habsburg codes were still being used. No one knew what was going to happen, and everyone wanted to make money. And so they really want to protect their contracts. And these are very little stories. 3 wagons of cabbage. I can't really get excited about them, but there's just these moments of why is this Croatian, testimony from the railway inspector in the Fiume archives from November, or is this? Yeah, this is December 1919. This shouldn't be here. If we follow the national story, it shouldn't be here. It's also being shown throughout the courts that it shouldn't be here. They're constantly canceling out one after the other about who's the court, what's the court look like, what's the name of the court. But what the lived reality of the court is not just that things are trying to keep on moving and they can't. Those 3 wagons of cabbage never arrived. But there's also this vision of 2 Croatians, both of them use diacritics in their names. Both of them actually complained against the government about not having their licenses renewed because, quote unquote, they were Croatian. We're still using the state to push forward their rights. And their rights were going to get changed. Strangely, in this case, Savko Ivančić's rights were recognized more than Ivan Rosic's rights. But one way or the other, if we look at the Fiume story as the De Nunzio story, as the national story, we would never understand why these 2 men's complaints got settled in court instead of in fights and knives and violence. And that it wasn't nationalist, it was between 2 Croatians. So, De Nunzio called Fiume the Holocaust city, the city that was, I know Holocaust is just, we could talk about this forever, was the purifying national moment. He saw it as the martyr city that was going to burn away, I know, you don't want to go there, the decrepitude of all the lies of liberalism. But on the ground, when you look at what's happening, is people are working along with the state that's pushing for annexation because they're getting promised that they're going to get what they had before, maybe more, maybe less, but whatever. Anyways, I think I went too long. I've been looking at myself so long. I really look forward to some questions.
Thank you so much, Dominique, for your presentation. And now we can take questions. So I encourage you to type your questions into the Q&A, and then I will read them out to Dominique, who will respond.
I hope there are questions, because why do we do this unless there are questions?
We have questions starting to come in. And the first question comes from Allison Johnson, who said she loved the talk and asked you to talk a little bit about how men and women encountered this time period differently.
Allison Frank Johnson always asks the tough questions. They actually, there's no way to think they encountered it the same. Partially because they didn't encounter their world before the same. And I looked at the state and what are the levels of the state and how much does it change or not, and how much does daily life change or not. And daily life in the Habsburg Empire, whether you were a man or a woman, was very different. And again, going back to law and citizenship, if you were a woman, what your identity, your rights were dependent on who you were married to or not married to. But also in terms of thinking about these soldiers in this town. What I was really struck with, some of it's in the book, I don't know how much, I maybe one day I should write an article, is what it means to be in a barracked town. So it was already a town of barracks before World War I, and then it became even more a town of barracks. It was a hub, but it was also a naval hub. Pula is close by, which was the main center, but also Fiume was a port town, and it was a port town that serviced men who worked on boats. What happens after World War I is that the majority of people there are extraneous states barracking themselves in the town. And there's a wonderful scholar, her name is Francesca Rolandi, who's studying prostitution in the town and what happens to women, especially women from the hinterlands. And Fiume becomes it's not really in my book, but it's something that's really been interesting me. Fiume becomes an employment hub for the very hungry 1919s and 20s of servicing these men. And I don't think it was fun to be a woman, even though they do get suffrage. So one thing I do want to add is De Nunzio always claims that, he's created this enormous utopia there. Actually, Fiume had introduced women's suffrage in the town before De Nunzio came. But this was a suffrage that was not really about choice, and it was more about presentation, that we have this many voters. So Allison Frank Johnson, one of my favorite humans on the planet, unfortunately, being a woman in Fiume was very different than being a man, and was not as great.
So we've had a number of questions come in the interim, and I'll try to pose them in some sort of logical order, if you will. So perhaps going and talking a bit more about the men who were in the city, these partiers, the bored men that you were talking about. How did they support themselves? The question is, were they still in a ghost of a military that had barracks and food? So beyond the currency issue that you talked about, if you could give us a sense of how they were living in the city during the time.
So there are two kinds of military in the city, right? There's the veterans from the Habsburgs, and then there are the inter-allied troops, and then there are the De Nunzio people. So the veterans are promised, and Gabor Egli and Ivan Jelicic have been studying this, I think Agnes Odassi as well. There were diplomatic, during the Soviet reign in Hungary, and then thereafter, there were negotiations about how to pay veterans, money. And the problem became that Fiume would only get money from Fiume for veterans for people who had Fiume Heimatrecht or pertinency. So there were many veterans in Fiume from the Habsburg Empire who had enlisted in Fiume or had been drafted in Fiume who did not get veterans payments because they were not Fiume pertinence or Heimatrecht. The Hungarian government promised to pay them that thing. And anyone who was in a Fiume, that category that, is difficult to understand, didn't get money. So they were encouraged to not be in Fiume. Any inter-allied person who was in the city was supposedly paid by their government. Because of the currency crisis, they couldn't get money. And so you had this weird situation between 1918 and 1919 where the military seemed like the most powerful people there, but because getting money into and out of Fiume was so difficult, everything was supposedly on credit, and there's all these bank rushes because the military isn't getting paid. And this isn't in my book, but the Italian National Council was like, we need to get money to these inter-allied soldiers so they can pay the Fiume, bakers and bar guys and all this stuff. And when De Nunzio comes, he does a lot of sneaky stuff with the Italian Red Cross, with the Italian state, and a lot of underhanded things to get money to pay his followers, to pay these, and this is a little bit in my book, to pay the legionnaires so that they don't get restless. But they have a lot more power. This is just true with every story. When you have military men in the civilian population and they aren't getting paid a lot, they use their power to up for the pay. So it's a very difficult situation. It's a great question, by the way.
So we have many more questions coming in. So a couple of categories before I pose the question. So one set of questions has to do with actually the population of Fiume, its composition. We have some questions speaking to the violence or lack of violence that you're talking about, questions about fascism and questions about empire. So perhaps we'll go in order. I know, very small, narrow categories.
To be immortal, never age.
So in terms of the population, if you could speak a little bit about the different languages that were spoken in Fiume, the religious composition of the population and how the citizens identified themselves in this period. And then a related question about the point of transition when Fiume became Rijeka, despite efforts to Italianize the city-state. If you can speak about that ultimate outcome for the city.
Ooh, okay, I'm gonna try. This is a boom town. So if you were talking about Fiume in 1810, the composition would be far more Italian speaking. Not because it was Italian, just because it was a dinky port town and it wasn't that important, and there were other port towns. But as it grew, more and more people came to live there. And that's not saying that Italians were the original inhabitants. It was always filled with Croatian speakers and then became filled with far more Hungarian speakers who had ever been there before. So by 1914, 13% of the population identified as Hungarian speakers. I mean, I think that's pretty amazing. 5% identified as German speakers, mother tongue, 5% mother tongue Slovenian, 26, 27, 28 Croatian mother tongue, 48, 49 Italian mother tongue. There's a wonderful historian, his name is Ivan Jelicic, who's been studying what does multilingualism mean for that. And what he shows is that probably over 70% of the population of Fiume, not Rijeka, so just that little town that I showed with the river, spoke Italian. What speaking Italian means and what literacy is and how good the Italian is, it's all over the place. But I would say to you, think of how we imagine a port town at the beginning of the 20th century where people are coming for jobs and they're coming from all over. And they're hit or missing it linguistically. Religiously, the town is mostly Catholic. So over 90% is Catholic. There's about 2% Protestant, 3% Jewish, about 2 to 3% Christian Orthodox, and then whatever. So it's basically a Catholic town of Central Europe and the Mediterranean that is growing exponentially. How does Fiume go to being Rijeka? That's the other part of the question. It's when the halves got put together. It's when I showed that there's the river and there's all these other parts. So under Italy, so after 1924, Mussolini annexes Fiume to Italy. So Fiume is this town I've been talking about is part of Italy, but on the other side of the river, that's part of what's Yugoslavia. And then after 1943, Germany basically occupies all of this. And then after 1948, what is Fiume becomes part of Yugoslavia, and it becomes one municipal unit. Sushak, which is the other side of the river, and then those other areas I was talking about that used to be part of Istria, they all become one city. So when I think about Vieca, I don't actually think of it as a national term. I think of it as when the hub becomes all of its parts. But it is also a national story. And anyone who's interested in this, there's wonderful histories about how this town has its own version of a ethnic cleansing before fascism, during fascism, and after fascism. And what happens after fascism is tens of thousands of Italian mother tongue people flee the region. Most of whom I personally think because of what happened during fascism, but also many who were anti-socialist and did not want to live in a socialist state. So today's Rijeka, which is at least 3 times, far more than 3 times bigger than the Fiume I'm talking about back then, is not the same city. It's in the same place, a little part of it, but in terms of what its culture is, what it feels like is home, is linked to the past, but it's also been linked to other pasts that were incredibly important.
So actually quite related to what you were just talking about, a question came in regarding the violence, and this is from Professor Branislav Jakovljevic, who is here at Stanford in the theater TAPS, the theater department. And he asked that he understands that a number of Croatian-speaking Fiumans were expelled from the city, which can certainly be categorized as an act of violence. So while there was no bloodshed, that doesn't mean that there weren't other forms of violence. And if you could perhaps comment on that.
Yeah, so actually, I'm working with these 2 scholars. We have an article coming out with a Journal of Modern History, and it speaks precisely to this question about the expulsions. There were expulsions, absolutely. And this is why that category of Heimatrecht pertinency matters. So it was not a expulsion that was determined on paper around national terms, although nationality clearly played a role. February 1920, they did a mass expulsion order of anyone who was not a Fiume pertinent or had not lived in the city at least 5 years, had to leave. Part of this was also because they had no food, and these were about ration cards. But most of it was national, and this is the perfectly correct question. Then in the summer, there was a killing of some Italian sailors in Split, in Dalmatia, and that turned into revolts throughout the Adriatic, in Trieste, in Istria, and also in Fiume. And that led to an enormous push out against Croatians. So although there had already been an order of expulsion in February 1920, in June and July 1920, this became much more nationally focused about expelling Croatians. What I've seen and what my colleagues have seen is that there's no way, this is a nationalist world, and Croatia was the problem, even more than Slovene. This is just like about Croatia, Slavonia. This isn't even about what we would later call Yugoslavia. If you were a poor Croatian, you were most likely going to get expelled if you didn't have Fiume pertinency. If you were a poor Italian, you would be less likely to be expelled if you didn't have Fiume pertinency. Legally, you should have both been expelled. What expulsion means, however, is very different than it meant 5 years before. 5 years before, expulsion was an option and heavily used by the state against the poor or the politically unwanted. And what would happen is you would be taken to the train station and you would be sent on your way with official, or the ships, depending on where you were getting sent, to where your home place was. In 1919, 1920, there is no system anymore. So they would walk you to the bridge and say you're expelled. And either people would stay at Sushak or go somewhere else, or they just cross the bridge right back or come around the side. So there's Francesco Rolandi has been doing this amazing research in which he's like, the only people whose expulsion really meant something was the richer people. The poorer people who had no other options just stopped going away. They just kept on staying. So the expulsion of the Croatians is a story, and it was incredibly difficult. And I've seen the letters of people going, I lost my store, I lost my home, I'm afraid, this is not the world I came in for. But if you had any choices, you left. If you didn't have any choices, you just kept on staying because it was such a weak state. So expulsion is a very iffy category in 1919, 1920.
So to talk a bit about issues of wealth and poverty and the economy, was 20th century or early 20th century Fiume a place that was plagued by the problem of rich politicians who knew nothing about the economy or perhaps couldn't care less about it, who were willing to sacrifice farmers, artisans, traders to this abstract cause of sovereignty?
There were some nationalists who didn't know about economic reasoning, but I would say the majority of these politicians who are pushing for annexation were doing it economically. This is a town that boomed because of state sponsorship by Budapest, by Hungary. They boomed, they made enormous amounts of money. This is the biggest GDP, this is the biggest capital producing place in the Habsburg kingdom before 1914, after Budapest. It's the biggest. Sushak is the biggest, the area crossing the river in Croatia, Slavonia after Zagreb. So if you think about how much money this place is making and why are they making money? They're making money because of their connections, not because of their independence. The push for annexation, there are nationalists. I'm not saying that it's not nationalist. But how they're doing it, and that's why I wanted to give that little taste of what the chapters feel like. How they're doing nationalism is very informed by their commercial interests.
A related question to that is about, through your research, and particularly what you showed us about currency and currency reform, and do you get the sense that Fiume's sort of average ones were economically literate, so to speak, and was following these kinds of bread and butter issues possible because this was a smaller scale state that enabled people to follow politics, that were at a more complex level, sort of more closely and more relevantly to their lives?
These people are so economically literate. It took me months to figure out how they think because of the exchange rates. So total digression, I was on the island of Saint Martin, which is divided in two. So it's half Dutch and it's half French. So they have three currencies. And the third one is the dollar because most of their tourists are Americans. And I went to the gas station and I said, so how do I pay? And the guy said, 1 second, pay me in this. And I'm like, well, how did you decide that? He's like, I was just thinking about the currency rates. So what I see happening in 1990 to 1920 is this enormous knowledge of all of the different values of currency. Think about what we were like when the euro happened and we were all given those calculators. These people are doing it in their heads. So this is a port town, capitalist, I'm only here because of the money, I miss my grandma, why am I here place. And the economic literacy from the bottom to the top is creepy. I literally needed to become better at arithmetic and percentages studying Fiume because they knew their rates. Does that mean they knew how to fix their problem? That's the difference, right? How do you work around a situation and how you solve a situation? What I see of this state, the National Council and the Municipal Council, is that they knew how to work in an empire and they wanted to get back into one because they didn't know how to do this alone. So I don't feel like these were the geniuses on the block, nor do I think these were like alienated capitalists who didn't care what was going on because they're all so rich. These are this is mercantilism. There's a very locally famous historian who called it a merchant state, and I don't think that's actually wrong.
So following from this comment that you made about empire, Peter Judson poses the question, what—
Peter Judson, my favorite guy.
I had to mention that he's here in the audience. So what about empire? It's implicit throughout, but could you say something explicit about engagement with and feelings about empire in this post-1918 period?
That's such a weird, it's such a perfect Judson question. It's such a hard one because empire for us means so many things, and who knows what empire meant for them. I do, and I brought this up somewhere else. I do know they were trying to figure out what empire meant after the fall of the empire. I do know that they ordered all these books about Italy in 1919, trying to study Italy and empire. So, if I could, I would show you a slide. I don't have it prepped. They ordered 15 books in January 1919, which is a big deal. I know this doesn't sound a big deal, but this is before Amazon. This is with the currency crisis. This is where they're a rogue state and getting anything there is impossible. The postal system isn't working. They ordered 19 books. Over half of them are about Italian empire. And another fourth of them are about successor states. And then the rest are about workers' contracts. Peter, you can't make this crap up. Like literally, they're asking the same question you're asking. And I guess that's the answer, is that that's the question they're asking. What is empire? Because they don't believe in a Wilsonian moment, they believe in a Wilsonian rhetoric.
So to shift gears a little bit and to talk about fascism, a question came in that said, I really love the way—
You said that the Stanford questions weren't hard.
I really love the way you decentered De Nunzio and the proto-fascist argument from the story of post-World War I Fiume as an explanation for the lack of violence. But what can this story tell us about the wider trajectory of fascism?
Well, I think this is incredibly important for the wider trajectory of fascism, that fascism is not a publicity stunt. It is not the poet dictator with his 200 followers and everyone's mesmerized by the weird poems. It's not about the fake constitution that was never put into place. It's not about the nudists. It's not fun. Fascism is not fun. Fascism is violent. Fascism is about taking over the state. Fascism is about party politics and making the party the state. And there is something very dangerous about Fiume being the origin story of fascism. It's almost like letting fascism off the hook. It's almost like, let's talk about the cherry tree. No, let's not talk about the cherry tree. Fiume is a weird cherry tree story that is not about fascism. It is about fascism for the people who went there, who then got kind of left with it being over. And they were already activists, and so they were still activists. And it is about the media and how this struck a chord that one could keep on striking. But this is not fascism. This is nationalism. Those are two different things. And I love that question because I consistently want to tell people, please, can we look at fascism?
We have a couple of questions here about sort of the non-Italian populations and how they responded to the propaganda and to the education reforms and generally to this presence of De Nunzio and his legionnaires.
So De Nunzio was not in charge of education in Fiume. Fiume was in charge. And even before 1914, Croatian was only taught in the provincial schools of the district. But right across the river in Sušak, there was a Croatian school, and Fiume residents or pertinents could send their children there. There were, not only were there over, depending if you count Slovenes and Croatians together, there were over 30% of the population in Fiume identified itself as mother tongue Slovene or Croatian. But Sušak and then all the hinterlands, Croatian was not a hard thing to come by. But it was never state. It was important for the Hungarian state, for Fiume, to not be part of Croatia-Slavonia. Croatia-Slavonia was an autonomous province or kingdom within Hungary. Fiume was autonomous as well. And using Italian and Hungarian and diminishing Croatian, it was not a language of the state. You had to use Hungarian or Italian. So what happens after 1918 is actually not that different from what was going on before. It's not like you could use people spoke Croatian and all the police knew Croatian and all the translators knew Croatian. You'd have a better chance getting a job in the offices if you knew Croatian, because a lot of the people coming in spoke Croatian. But Croatian was never a language of state before 1914, and so having it not being a language of state after 1918 is not that big a difference. Sušak is still in Croatian. The National Council of Serb, Croats, and Slovenes get moved to Sušak by the British and the American. So it's the same, but it's different. The difference is that now it's not Habsburg, it's Italian. And it's not pleasant. I mean, I wouldn't want to be in there. And so my last chapter on propaganda and nationalism talks about this principal. It ends with a principal who almost gets fired because she's an Italian nationalist, but she doesn't want to force Croatian and Slovenes to recite all these really creepy poems and songs against Slavs, and she almost gets fired for it. But on the other hand, she doesn't. So it's not fun. There is no nostalgia for being in Fiume in 1919. This is not the Kumbaya world. It's just not the same world as the one we've been expecting, and I think that's why there's less violence.
So we're coming up on the end of our time. We do have 3 more questions. They're all quite different from each other. The first one is, if you could say a little bit about the relationship between Fiume and the rest of the world. For instance, was Wilson, well, a little more narrowly than that, was Wilson at all influenced by concerns about ethnic European groups that were in the US in response to the crisis? So did the ethnic groups in the US in any way impact Wilson's response?
Okay, Larry Wolf has a great book on Wilson. I will say about Fiume, he made this really weird speech in Ohio about, if we went on a city's nationality, New York should be Italian. So he made a real distinction in his head, and he pushed this through about economics and nationalism. And his arguments about why Fiume should not be part of Italy also use nationalism. He made it very explicit that this is not he basically said it could go either way. But his point was, Italy already has Trieste, and they have Venice, and they have Ancona, and they have Bari. So if we give them Fiume too, they have a monopoly. His argument about Fiume was not about nation. He used nation to make an economic argument about free trade.
The next question is about actually your research process. And if you could just talk a little bit about the primary locations of your original source material that you used for the basis of the book, and also how long it took you to complete your research.
The book took forever. I basically worked in Rijeka in Fiume, and I worked in the Vittoriale, which is De Nunzio's like weird mini golf villa. Partially because of what he brought there, but he also stole a lot of the archive of the city when he left. And then a lot of people kept on giving stuff to that archive. So there is no Fiume archive. I did not work in Rome. I worked in Rome a little, but I didn't work in Rome a lot because almost all the histories are based on the Rome archive. So I basically just did everything anyone else hadn't done. And the biggest thing I did was Rijeka. And I'm so glad for that question, because I just want to say if you've read the book or look at the book, you'll see how the world did you do this? Because I could only do this because of those archivists. Boris Zakoszek and Mladen Uren in Rijeka and Alessandro Tonacci at the Vittoriale, they literally spent years with me talking about how do we find that mechanic. I mean, who gets that kind of, these are people who were so excited that I was asking different questions, and they loved being part of it, and they are sociologists in their hearts, and this is a history as much as it is a sociology.
And the final question actually takes us outside of Fiume to nearby Abbazia or Opathia, which this question comes from someone who recently reread Nabokov's memoir, Speak Memory, and he describes in it sort of idyllic summers spent with his family in Opathia. This is a question from Margaret Hertzen, and she says that she imagined this area as a Riviera for the well-to-do pre-revolutionary Russians. So I don't know if you can comment about what was going on and sort of beyond what you've talked about, you know, what peoples this area drew, because Opathia, of course, is very close to Fiume. I don't know how much sort of.
Oh, it's totally true. And I'm working on a book now on Fiorello LaGuardia, who lived in this region at the early 20th century, and just looking at the amount of wealth that is just traveling through this area is unbelievable. And it is about Opathia, it is about Abbazia. I'm sure that whoever asked this question, I hope they know about the important Jewish story about Abbazia and Opathia, in which it is one of the rare Rivieras that has very fancy synagogues, kosher meat, kosher bakeries, everything, in order to service Budapest and Vienna on their Mediterranean holidays, much better than Trieste does. So if you think about this region, and Fiume is fascinating too, because they don't just have a very important synagogue, they have two of both Ashkenazi and Sephardic. So this region, this Riviera of wealth, is also a Riviera of enormous disparities in who the populations are of this wealth, and they're totally fine with servicing them all. And I would love to write a chapter on railways. I'm thinking about doing that, because these places are beautiful. If you've ever been there, the view from that part of the Corner Gulf is just unbelievable. And it was so fast to get there. They really did understand how to make it like the Miami Beach, the sixth borough of New York City. And I think that it's not wrong to think of it that way.
And the emperor vacationed in Opathia, did he not?
Yeah.
In his time.
Yes, absolutely. And the sound of music, that's all Fiume money.
So thank you for staying with us a little longer. In curating and posing the questions, what I omitted was the number of exquisites, wonderfuls, Love the book, love the presentation that came through from our audience. And I want to echo that and tell you how really delighted we are that you could be with us today, and to thank you for your fascinating talk, your fascinating work, and for being so generous in answering all of our questions. And brava. Thank you.
That means a lot. I mean, I know this is insane, but in this world of COVID, that means a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you. And thank you everybody for joining us and for posing so many interesting questions and engaging so actively. I know we can't see each other, but we feel the presence. So thank you, and we hope to see you at other events as well. Thank you again.
Thank you.
All right, bye.